I wanted to share with you a recent study that was completed by the University of Chicago, also the MIT, which tried to find proof of whether these biases influence business decisions. And what they did was they distributed 5,000 resumes and to 1,250 companies. So each company got 4 resumes. These companies have open positions, and in a preliminary interview that was conducted with the HR departments, they all said that they were aggressively seeking diversity. So let's see what the results were. Now, I have to mention that there was a key distinction in these 5,000 resumes. Some had typically white names, while others had typically black or African American, if you prefer, names. In fact, every company was sent out 4 resumes, one of each race that was considered an average resume, average because of the background, the education, how well that person fit into the open job, etc. So one of each race that was considered average, and one of each race that was considered highly skilled. Now let's see what happened, and I will share with you the results. These people were these resumes were sent out. The idea was to measure how many of those were called back by these 1,250 companies for an interview. So the result. Now, first of all, resumes with typically white names received more callbacks than those with the typically black names. How many more? 50% more. So that's a significant number. It's not 5%, 10%, that you could attribute to any other reasons, the design of the study or any other, error that could be happening in the way it was displayed. No, 50% more callbacks for typically white names and typically black names. Of course, all the names were fake. There were no actual candidates, but they used this just to see if there was actually a bias or not. Secondly, there was no difference between the number of calls that typically black name candidates received in terms of whether they were average or highly skilled. So if you were black, it didn't really matter if you were average or an outstanding celebrity performer, as Matthew would say, right? It didn't make any difference. And thirdly, the typically white name candidates, again, good or average, always receive more callbacks than the typically black name candidates. So, in other words, and just to summarize, if you were black, it doesn't matter, it didn't matter how good you were. And if you were not black, white, Caucasian, as you prefer, it didn't matter either if you were average or not. Now let's see how we are doing in terms of time. We still have some time before the break. I wanted to share with you an example of how this works, because this study was replicated in other countries, not with exact figures, but in France there was an initiative by the French government a few years ago when they said, well, if this is happening, and I think they used typically French names and names that were of African descent, names that sounded Arab. Okay, didn't matter if the Arabs were third-generation French nationals, but they used those names, and the result was that if you were if you happened to have a name of Arab, in Arabic, or a name that sounded, Arab, you got 3 times less chances of being called into an interview. Okay, so they said, well, let's be clever here. How about, we blind CV, and we don't display names, we don't even display gender while we are at it. Let's not even display the address, because of course, if you were from the outskirts of the main cities, the banlieues, as they call them, and please forgive me because I barely speak English, but French, I just don't have the time yet. Maybe when my toddlers are older. But I apologize if I'm disgracing the beautiful French language with my pronunciation. But anyway, if you lived in the outskirts, in the banlieues, you also had a negative bias. So they said, let's discard all that, and let's institute by law a blind CV, and let's see what happens. And well, that was one, I think one initiative that, I think, they deserve some praise, because they tried to do something about it. What was the problem? The problem was when the candidates arrived at the interviews. And when they arrived at the interviews, something funny happened. And I have, I can share with you an example. And we call this, by the way, the affinity bias.